Hi, this is Scott Bradfield, and this is the latest episode of Reading Great Books in the Bathtub. We have our toothbrush, we have our toothpaste. Let me see, put this aside here. We have our shampoo, and we have our new challenge for the bathtub reading, which is William Gaddis's J.R. I want to make a few statements before we go into the bathtub with this book. Some of the first most obvious statements I'd like to make is how unpleasant a book it looks like to take into the bathtub. Okay, it's not the sort of, it looks like it's been through the bathtub at least. It looks like it's taken several baths over the lifetime of this book. My history with this book is fraught with peril and pleasure. I've had great pleasure with this book and great terrible times, and they've gotten much more pleasurable as they go along. I bought this book at the Green Apple bookstore in San Francisco in like 1973 or 74. And I bought it with a copy of the Recognitions. I don't have my small paperback copy of the Recognitions, but I bought it about this. This came out as originally as a hardback and paperback original at the same time, which was unusual in the 70s. And it looks incredibly unpleasant to read. I've got to tell you this. Here's the text. It's 700 pages of very dense, unattractive font, very small print, and it looks like a chore from the moment you pick it up. It also has lots of quotes on the back, making it clearly a serious novel and not what it really is, which is a pretty funny goddamn book. I wanted to say a few things about how we read books inaccurately all the time, and the literary kind of culture that we inhabit kind of forces us to do that. Gaddis was a novelist, a very peculiar novelist, and not the sort of novelist that I normally like to read. I've talked a bit about the writers I do really like to read: George Simenon and Brian Moore and Alison Lurie and Richard Yates, writers who kind of consistently write good fiction throughout the course of a lifetime and often experiment with the forms of fiction and do different things. Raymond Carver, Tobias Wolff, people who keep trying different games with each story they write, but have certain basic techniques at their disposal, and they're always entertaining to read. Gaddis is a very peculiar one to me. Here's his first book, The Recognitions. I'll try to show you my favorite edition of this, which is the small mass market paperback, which is like a little brick. And he wrote this first novel of his in the 50s. It was published in, oh gosh, I should know this, but it was published in the late 50s, I believe. And it is really long. It's really dense. It seems 1955. And another big, unpalatable looking book called The Recognitions has some great stuff in it. Don't get me wrong, some wonderful passages of writing. He really does have a sort of poetic prose, sort of this muscular, driving prose. It's just, I don't want to use all the cliches. It's dense. It has unusual images. It has a certain flow to it that you don't really see in other writers, and it's a very unique type of prose. And there's some very funny passages. There's also long, endless, boring passages where every tiny detail of a scene is elaborated. And it reminds me sometimes of a book that I had real trouble reading, which was Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. A very talented writer like Gaddis, but just these kind of long, obsessive passages that seemed to be inside jokes. And there's a lot of that in the Recognitions. Gaddis wrote this novel in the 50s. It was not an easy book to review. The reviewers did not know what to do with it, and I can sort of sympathize with them. You get a book like this, it takes a lot of concentration. It's almost 1,000 pages long, and you need to turn in a sensible review of the book within a few weeks. It wasn't well reviewed. It wasn't accurately reviewed. When you pick a book like this up, you almost immediately start going to look for those books that I'm trying to warn you against, which are online versions or library books which describe the plot to you. And there's plenty of stuff like that available. The redoubtable Stephen Moore, one of Gaddis's great champions over the years and a fascinating academic, has done a huge a redevelopment project of projecting and assembling all of the data and all the references in books like this. And they're very useful to some extent, but they don't help you as a reader. 20 years after this, Gaddis spent his next 20 years pretty much being a failure. He went around, got bits of grants here and there. He did some boring copy editing jobs, I think. He maybe wrote a screenplay or something. And he kind of lived in the shadow of his book's failure. And somewhere during that 20 years, he got the idea for this book called J.R., which came out in early 70s, 73. I bought it not long after it was published. 1975. Okay, I'm sorry. 1975 must have been when I bought it when I was living in San Francisco. And I must have got this as soon as it came out. This book came out and got a lot of weird press, which is that here's a book that was really a failure, critical failure. This book comes out 20 years later, and the critics basically say, oh, it's a big book and he's important, but it's not as good as Recognitions. And that strikes me as one of the real tragedies in the history of literary criticism. Is I don't think most of the critics read either of these books. I don't think they could. And I know because the first times I read J.R., I had a hard time just following it, just understanding what was happening in the book. And I was also kind of frustrated by the way it looked. So I didn't quite understand what was happening in it. And I started reading essays describing what happened in it. And I wrote lots of notes. I still have all these notes, which are kind of, what graduate students would write about the different ways postmodernity is established in this text and how it has how it does things with language and how it represents itself as serious literature, blah blah. And in the course of reading that first time through, I saw that there was some good stuff in it, but I was usually lost. And I was lost mainly because I wasn't reading the book. I was reading all these other books. It's my biggest warning in this whole shebang of presentations is we got to read the damn book. I taught the book a couple of times, unsuccessfully. And then one year when I was in Germany, I think I taught this book in Berlin one year. And I came upon the idea that what we were going to do is instead of discuss all the books about J.R., is we were going to read the book and we were going to read it out loud to each other. So I asked everyone just to read it, to look for passages that they thought were funny. Because J.R. is a hilarious book. And you don't really recognize it until you start to do just the fine reading of knowing what's happening on each page. Say this again. You have to read it like a reader. It establishes very simple technical rules pretty early on. And I'll try to go through those in the next section of this introductory lecture. It establishes some simple rules pretty early, and you need to follow those rules and go along with it. And it will take you into it's basically a huge, giant Marx Brothers film. It's a farce with voices and men and people and women and just coming in and out of doors for about 700 pages and escalating chaos. Escalating and multiply escalating chaos as this American machine of money keeps churning out shit. Literally shit for 700 pages. And in the midst of all of this shit are a number of very, very human, moving, affectionate characters, some of whom are some of the best characters I've ever read in a contemporary novel. I think Gibbs is one of the great comic, tragic characters of all contemporary literature. And Bast himself, the central character. And J.R., the young boy, the little boy, really, who's at the heart of the whole plot, is a kind of a Dickensian waif wandering through this, who's hilarious and who's monstrous and who becomes everything America wants him to be. So it's a very funny book. It takes patience. it takes basically reading of about 25 to 50 pages a day because there's so many characters that you're going to forget them, as I will do in the course of trying to read along with this book. Read this book along with you is what I'm trying to say. And I have read it now 2 or 3 times with just total pleasure. And unlike the recognitions or the books that Gaddis wrote after this, I don't think there's a wasted word in it. It's almost every scene is pitch perfect, is sharp, does exactly what it needs to do, and the plot is very complicated, but seems to just seamlessly works together. So one of the things I've always felt was that J.R. was one of the great neglected books of the 20th century, because when people talk about Gaddis, they usually talk about this book, The Recognitions, which is much harder to read and is not as satisfying. And the books that were most successful for Gaddis were the 2 books he wrote after this, Carpenter'S Gothic, which is a very short novel, and then his last novel, A Frolic of His Own, which is satire on the legal profession, neither of which is that good. So what I'm trying to say is he was one of those exceptions to me. He was a novelist who was best known for writing a book which is worth reading but is not one of my favorite books. He was never really a great novelist, as these other writers I've talked about, Yeats or Brian Moore or Flaubert or Dickens even. But in the course of his career, he wrote this one amazing book. It's a hilarious book. It deserves to be read out loud at parties. It's that funny. And it's a beautiful book and a moving book. And I'm hoping that we can just we'll read along with this in less programmatic ways than we did with Ulysses. I think I'm just going to try to do 50 to 100 pages. And when my brain is oversaturated with just the plot material, I just like to talk you through the scenes, point out the significant scenes, remind you who the characters are and what's happening. That's all I'm going to try to do in this, and maybe read out some funny passages. And in the course of that, I thought we would just do 6 to 8 little lectures as I basically feel I'm forgetting things. What is it? The more I put into my brain, I start crowding out other stuff. What's that old Homer Simpson joke? Every time I learn something new, it pushes something old out of my brain. Once this starts pushing stuff out of my brain, I'll try to do a new lecture simply to point out what's happened in the past 40, 50, 60 pages. All right, that's the game plan. And try to get I think all the editions are the same. It's worth having the same edition we're reading simply because I'll be referring to pages in our discussions. And I think even the later Penguin editions of J.R. are the same pagination as this one. But this one's easy to get. So get to it. Read the first 30, 40 pages. I'm going to do the first proper lecture after this one and after my bath. And we will talk about when I come back, we'll do the first 40 or 50 pages of JR and just get you into the water. Okay? Again, when you take this into the bathtub, you will need to put lots of towels around the bathtub because the water displacement effect will be massive because this is a profound book. It's very dense. And as soon as you get into the tub with it, water's going to come up over the side. So get lots of towels around you in the tub. Okay? I'll be back in a little while with the next lecture in this series.